This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. It's Friday, and that means it's time for the Kitchen Table series. And in today's video, we're moving on to deck number 30, Mono Green Druids. Hello and welcome back, fans of MTG Burgeoning. Here we are with our longest running series in channel history. We are back with deck number 30, and now we are moving to a mono green druid build. As is generally customary with this series, we begin each deck tech with the land base, and there's not going to be a lot of surprises here. We're playing mono green, so we're going to throw in a stack of forests, exactly 17 of them, 17 forests to start off and complete the land base of this build. That's it, 17 lands. We're playing elves, folks, so we don't need, we're playing druids, so we don't need a ton of lands. So now let's move on to some ways in which that we can enhance our mana producing capabilities, because although druids can tap to add green mana and elves can do it as well, there is a very large subset of green creatures that fit both the elf and druid creature type. And in this deck, we are going to take advantage of being the elves and the druids, but this is definitely a druid-focused and druid-themed deck, as you'll see as we continue with the deck tech. So, one play set of Elvish Guidance, 2 and a green. It's an enchant land, so it's an aura for a land. And it reads, whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds a green mana to their mana pool for each elf in play. So that just doesn't affect the elves that we're going to have, but also any opponents that may unfortunately be playing with elves. 4 copies of Elvish Guidance. Next up, we are including a full playset of Leyline of Abundance. It's an enchantment from Core Set 2020, 2 and 2 green. And of course, it being a Leyline, it gives us the ability to put it into play right onto the battlefield if it's in our opening hand. And whenever we tap a creature for mana, we add an additional green. So this makes every one of our druids that can tap for 1 green mana, well, now they tap for 2 green mana. And lastly, we can tap 6 and 2 green to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. The last ability is a little overcosted. I don't see us using that ability very much in this deck, but tapping a creature for an additional green mana, oh, we're going to use that ability, and we're going to use it a lot. 4 copies, 1 full play set of Leyline of Abundance. Next up, we are going to include 2 copies of a card that I believe was constructed, designed, and printed and created just for elves and just for druids, and that is Paradox Engine. Whenever we cast a spell, we untap all non-land permanents we control. Well, our creatures are non-land permanents, and our creatures are acting as lands, so we're going to tap our creatures to cast a creature, and then we're going to untap those creatures because of the Paradox Engine. And additionally, as we are going to show the very warped things we're going to do with this deck, in addition to tapping the creatures that are needed to cast the spell, well, we're going to tap creatures to just create a pool of green mana that's going to allow us to either win the game or have the opponents at the table throw up their arms in disgust and storm off from the metagame, never to return. 2 copies, Paradox Engine. All right, so we are going to include 1 copy of Coat of Arms, and this is just in case, we are having a little bit of trouble pulling off our Druid chicanery through the game. I always like to include an additional win condition if possible, and having a Coat of Arms in place, even though it could help out the armies of our opponents. We like to think that we're going to have a better and stronger army with all the number of druids in play. So 1 copy of Coat of Arms is going to be added just for the purposes of another way in which to win the game, and that's going to be through combat. Keeping in mind with the idea that coat of arms represents, we are also going to include 3 copies of Door of Destinies. It's an artifact for 4. When it comes into play, we choose a creature type, which for the purposes of this deck will be Druids. And whenever we cast a spell of the type, we put a charge counter on Door of Destinies, and creatures we control of that type get +1/+1 for each counter on Door of Destinies. This is to prevent the direct damage that could be done to our tiny little 1/1 or 2/2 elves. We want to make sure that when they come into play, they have a robust toughness so that no targeting direct damage spells or mass direct damage spells will have that great of an effect on them. Yeah, so we have to make sure we protect our guys when they're in play, and Door of Destinies helps with the defense of that, and also it will help from a coat of arms style of combat aggression if we need to seek out that avenue of victory. And our last spell that we are including, the rest are going to be all creatures. The last spell we are going to include, if you've noticed so far, we have 4 auras, we have 4 enchantments, and we have 6 artifacts. And this is the only sorcery spell in the deck. So that's going to create a very, very nice recipe of success if we get into our hand and the mana available to cast it, Primal Surge. This mythic rare from Avacyn Restored is 8 and 2 green and says, exile the top card of our library. If it's a permanent card, you may put it onto the battlefield. And if you do, repeat this process. So as an additional win condition, we pretty much get the Primal Surge into our hand. We speed up to 10 mana, which, I'm going to be honest, I've been able to pull this off by turn 3. We get Primal Surge, we cast it, we put our entire deck in play, and we win the game right there, because either our opponents are going to scoop or they're going to get overrun by an army of elves, an army of druids, the likes of which they have never seen before. And you're going to see why that is very soon. All right, so let's meet the druids of our elf druid build. 4 copies of Llanowar Elves. Notice it is druid type. There is an elf presence, but we're leaning towards druids. You'll see why as we get closer to the conclusion of this deck tech. It's the typical elf, 1 green, 1/1, turn it sideways, add a green mana to the mana pool. 4 copies of Llanowar Elves. Next up, we have Llanowar Elves version 2.0, and that's going to be Miss Elvish Mystic. Again, check it out. It is a druid. So it's a green, it's 1/1, we tap it, and it adds a green. And also keep in mind that they're also elves, which is going to help activate our Elvish Guidance. 4 copies of Elvish Mystic. Next up, we are playing with an entire playset, 4 copies again of Arbor Elf. Again, it's 1 green, it's 1/1. This does not tap to add a green mana, however, it turns sideways to untap target forest. So for all intents and purposes, we are able to generate an additional forest by turning him sideways and untapping one of our forests. However, as I slightly shift Arbor Elf over to the right, thereby exposing the Elvish Guidance down there, a forest enchanted by Elvish Guidance that we tap for a ton of green mana because we have so many elves in play, and then we tap the Arbor Elf to untap that forest, allowing us to tap the Elvish Guidance again for an obscene amount of green mana. 4 copies, Arbor Elf. All right, so the CMC of our elves are going to jump considerably. Of our druids are going to jump considerably as we go from a CMC of 1 all the way to a CMC of 3. 4 copies. Jeez, I'm all over the place today. 4 copies of Elvish Archdruid. Druid. 1/2 green, 2/2 body, and other elf creatures we control get +1/+1. So there's that buffing for defense against direct damage, and we tap Elvish Archdruid to add a green mana to our mana pool for each elf we control. So far, every one of our creatures are druids and elves. I promise you the druid influence is coming. 4 copies of Elvish Archdruid. Next up, we are also going to play with a full play set of Elvish Harbinger. Another elf druid. It's 2 and a green for a 1/2 body, and when it ETBs, we search our library for an elf card, reveal it, shuffle our library, and put that card on top of it. And we can tap Elvish Harbinger to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. 4 copies of Elvish Harbinger. Now we get into the part where the Druids become a little bit more noticeable. And that is with an entire playset, a full 4 of Gilt-Leaf Archdruid. 3 and 2 green. She's a 3/3. Whenever we cast a Druid spell, we draw a card. And we tap 7 untapped Druids we control, and we gain control of all lands target player controls. So if we just put her off to the side here for a moment, not out of mind, now we want to be able to see her because she is so integral to this deck. So we have any combination of Llanowar Elves, Arbor Elves, Elvish Mystics, Elvish Harbingers, and or Elvish Archdruids in play. We have a Paradox Engine. We're tapping our Elves to play a Druid spell. We are accumulating more and more green mana. We're drawing a card every single time we cast a Druid spell, and we're untapping all of our creatures. This is the engine that we're trying to run here with this Druid deck. And Gilt-Leaf Archdruid is a vital cog to that plan. All right, and we are down to our last 4 cards of this deck, and there's still 4 creatures. And the last 2 are going to be a bit of a surprise. So we're going to save those for the end, of course, because we're sticking with our Druid theme as we continue with this deck tech. 2 copies of Kamahl, Fist of Kroza. 4 and 2 green. It's a 4/3 body. It's a Druid legend. And we can tap a green and target land becomes a 1/1 creature until end of turn. It's still a land. We can tap 2 and triple green, and creatures we control get the overrun effect, which is +3/+3 and trample. So Kamahl helps to kind of put an exclamation point on our potential need to win via combat, particularly if we have a coat of arms in play, and or if we have any number of copies of Door of Destinies. And just imagine, with enough lands in play, we can actually send the lands into combat as well. 2 copies, Kamahl, Fist of Kroza. And that brings us to cards number 59 and 60, and they are going to act as a surprise to this deck for any dedicated elf and or druid players out there. But before judgment is passed, before torches are ignited, and before pitchforks are sharpened, allow me an opportunity to describe exactly what we can do with this deck. So, the final 2 cards, the last 2 of this deck, are 2 copies of Spawnsire of Ulamog. It's an Eldrazi for 10, it's 7/11, and it has Annihilator 1. It has a couple of abilities here. Its first ability is we can tap 4 colorless mana, and we can put 2 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens from the battlefield. Onto the battlefield. Create 2 Eldrazi spawns, and they have sacrifice this creature for 1 colorless mana. That's pretty good, particularly in an elf/druid deck where we're looking for maybe a mid to late game mana sink if we're having trouble closing it out. However, the more intriguing and interesting ability is the one underneath it, whereby tapping 20 mana, which, let's be honest, if you've played Elf Ball, if you've played a Druid Ball, 20 mana is nothing in a deck like this. Tap 20, cast any number of Eldrazi cards you own from outside the game without paying their mana costs. So depending on how your metagame works with cards you own from outside the game, or if you have to have a dedicated sideboard, you put into that sideboard 4 copies of Emrakul, Eon's Torn. You put in 4 copies of Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. You put in 4 copies of Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. And then you fill it off with maybe a few All Is Dusts. And if needed, your Druid deck turns into an Eldrazi deck with the investment of 20 mana. Or, more likely scenario in the case of my playgroup, you cast that first Emrakul, you take your extra turn, and then you just overwhelm the board with a combat that just sends all of your opponent's life total right into the red. 2 copies, Spawnsire of Ulamog, and I bet you didn't see that one coming. And that, fans of MTG Burgeoning, is deck number 30 of the Kitchen Table series. Mono Green Druids. Let's shuffle it up and let's see how quickly or efficiently or effectively, or if it can even happen at all, we can get this Druid Ball engine rolling. All right, so let's shuffle this bad boy up. Our mono green Druid deck. Yes, I know. I mean, a case could be made that this is just an elf deck 2.0 going all the way back to Kitchen Table Series deck number 5, but it's not. It's different. The Druid influence is much different than the elf influence. We utilize the elves to generate the mana that the Druids need to close out the game. Oh. Alright, so let's give this bad boy a run. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Oh, perfect. Forest to start. There's an elf. There's our Elvish Archdruid. My goodness, Door of Destinies. Oh, there's the Primal Surge. Alright. Oh, it would have been nice if we could have drawn... Actually, that wouldn't have helped too much. I was thinking the ley line, but we don't have any of those elves in play. Alright, we keep. Let's see what we can do. Turn 1, we draw Forest. Forest goes down. Arbor Elf into play, turn 1. Untap. Turn 2, draw. Forest goes down. Tapping 2. Untapping that, tapping that for a 3rd, casting Elvish Archdruid. Untap. Okay. Turn 3, big turn, give us an elf. That's what we were looking for. Beautiful. We're going to tap that for 1 green mana. We are going to cast an Elvish Mystic. We are tapping the Elvish Archdruid for 3 green mana. We are using that 3 green mana to enchant that lovely untapped forest right there. And then, can we do it this turn? Can we do it this 3, 6, 7? Nope, next turn we can though. So let's tap this for 3. Let's untap it. We'll tap that for 4. We'll cast a Door of Destinies. And we will hope that from the time that our turn ends to the beginning of our next turn, we will not lose too many of our elves, and we're going to just assume that our opponents are not playing with elves either. We move to turn 4, we draw a card. Man, that's a lot of lands. We drew more than a quarter of our lands in this deck already. And then we're just going to Primal Surge it. 3, 6, 9, 10. We cast a Primal Surge. It is not countered. We exile every single card from the top of our library, which will, and every single card is a permanent. So what's going to end up happening is we're going to have all of our forests go into play, and they're all going to be untapped. And then we're going to have additional copies of Elvish Guidance, which are going to be on those lands, which we're going to be able to tap to utilize Spawnsire of Ulamog's 20 ability. We're going to be able to cast our Emeralds to get our extra turns, cast our Kozilek. We don't want to cast Kozileks because we won't have any cards in our hand. We got to keep that in mind that we're not going to exile the entire deck. We have the ability to do that. That's why there's 2 copies of the Spawnsire in there. So once we hit copy number 1, which is right here, we would put it into play. We would tap our lands that have the Elvish Guidance, enchanting them. And then we would cast our Eldrazi. We will untap, take our extra turn, and attack with so many huge, ginormous elves, particularly because we have all of our generals in play. We'll have a Kamal in play. We'll have more and more mana that we can do with. And that, turn 4, that was a fantastic way to show what this Druid engine is capable of. And I tempt the gods of Magic no further in my fate with this video. We end on that playtest, folks. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Druids.